As you can see from the abundance of our co-sponsors, Dr. Ansari's work speaks to many audiences across several disciplines. We are so excited for Dr. Ansari's talk today, Ancient Philosophy in the Islamic World, Illusion, Perception, and Reality in al-Farabi's Refutation of Parmenides of Elea. Dr. Ansari holds a PhD in philosophy from Georgetown University and is an assistant professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University. Her research involves the transmission of ancient Greek philosophy into Arabic and Islamic metaphysics in both the classical and post-classical periods, the philosophy of language, and the relationship between rational and supra-rational forms of knowledge in Islamic philosophy. Dr. Ansari's forthcoming monograph, Language and Being in the Philosophy of al-Farabi, is on metaphysics and language in the philosophy of al-Farabi. We are recording this presentation, as you noticed. Therefore, we ask that the audience members do not record with their personal devices. If you want to see any portion of the presentation later, you will be able to find it on the IMESC YouTube channel. It's linked on our webpage. If you go to csus.edu/IMESC, IMESC, you can find the YouTube channel link there. Dr. Ansari has generously agreed to take questions after the presentation, so we look forward to continuing the conversation after the talk has concluded. If you haven't already, please, again, feel free to grab a box lunch and some drinks and get comfortable. We very much appreciate you joining us today. And without further ado, please help me give a very warm welcome to Dr. Rosabel Ansari.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to be out here in California. And I start by giving deepest to her and to Nikos for bringing me here. I know we already heard all the organizers and co-sponsors, but I want to list them again because it's really such an honor that so many places and departments in this university have come together to bring me here. So the Iranian and Middle Eastern Studies Center, the Hellenic Studies Program, the Departments of History, Philosophy, Humanities and Religious Studies, as well as the minor in Middle Eastern Islamic Studies, the minor in Modern World, and the Living Scholars Program. I'm so grateful to all of you for making this happen. So my talk today is entitled Ancient Philosophy in the Islamic World, Illusion, Perception, and Reality in al-Farabi's Refutation of Parmenides of Elea. A lot of words there. I'm just going to start by giving you a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. It's going to involve two introductions because I'm sure there's some names there that we're maybe not familiar with. So just as a brief historical introduction to the ancient philosophy in the Islamic world, what exactly is this period? This might be new to some of you. So I'll just begin very brief overview of ancient philosophy, right? We have our three main protagonists. So we have Socrates, we have Plato, we have Aristotle. I'm sure all of you have heard of those names. Socrates is famous as being one of the founders of Western philosophy, but he himself didn't write anything down. But he's really known as when philosophy begins. It's really important because anybody that came before Socrates is known as a pre-Socratic, and Parmenides is one of those, right? Pre-Socratic. I'll explain more about that in my second introduction. So we have Socrates and then his student Plato. And everything we know about Socrates is written down by Plato in dialogues where you have Socrates is discussing philosophical issues with different people in ancient Greece. And then you have the student of Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle he makes philosophy, like he moves away from the dialogue style of writing we find in Plato to more like dense philosophical works that sometimes are a bit more difficult to read. Now, how does this relate to the Islamic world? So the Islamic world, Islamic civilization comes out of Arabia and very quickly moves into what was, or at that time still was, Greek-speaking world, Byzantine Empire, very quickly comes under Islamic rule. And within about 100 years of Islamic rule, the Islamic Empire launched what was called the translation movement of translating Greek texts, ancient Greek texts into Arabic. This was a state-sponsored program. It lasted about 200 years, and it involved the Islamic ruling elite sponsoring usually Christian translators who would translate from Greek into Arabic for primarily Islamic audience who did not read Greek. It was one of the biggest events in the history of like Western history. Really good books on this I can recommend if anybody wants to learn more. And it's important to think of it as really a state-sponsored program as part of empire building. And so, one of the big parts of the story to the history of philosophy is that Aristotle, I told you guys about our three protagonists, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle is really seen as the crowning jewel of philosophy. He's really seen as the philosopher. He's actually called the philosopher in Arabic. And he's seen as the one who like perfected and completed philosophy. And after Aristotle, the job of philosophers is really just to explain and teach what Aristotle taught. And that's really important for Farabi. Okay, so I think now I can move on to the second introduction. We're going to talk now who are our figures, Parmenides and Farabi. They're not the main protagonists I just outlined. So he comes from before Socrates, which means we actually know very little about him. None of his own writings survive, except in like fragments. We don't actually have like his complete works. We just have little passages here and there that are preserved by later authors who are usually discussing him in a very polemical fashion. So that's what we're going to see with Farabi. He discusses Parmenides in a very polemical way. We don't really know the real Parmenides. We just know he's represented in the later sources. He is famous in the later sources, particularly in Aristotle, for having a theory of monism, which is a word that comes from Greek word means one. It's a oneism or oneness. The idea that everything is one, right? All of existence, everything is one. Contemporary scholars today debate what that means. So some scholars will say he had this theory of monism, but it was a theory that was separate from perceptual world that we see. He didn't really think that that everything is one. It was like everything has one principle or some sort of theory that doesn't mean anything, that requires the world to literally be one thing. But that's the contemporary reading. That's not how Aristotle read Parmenides, and it's not how Farabi read Parmenides. So the most common reading of Parmenides in the ancient tradition and in the Islamic tradition was that Parmenides was a radical monist, right? So he believed, and this is where the title of my talk about illusion, perception comes into play. He was understood to be advocating that the existence is literally one thing. So everything we perceive, everything we think we see is really just some sort of illusion. So that was Aristotle's reading of Parmenides, and that was the reading that Farabi would also adopt. So who is Farabi? Okay, Farabi is a 10th century Islamic philosopher. He wrote in Arabic. He read Greek philosophy in Arabic translation. I mentioned we had this 200-year translation period, a translation movement that really valorized Aristotle. So Farabi was a part of that. He really saw Aristotle as the culminating figure of all of philosophy. And he read a lot of these Greek texts in Arabic translation with Christian teachers, so with the translators themselves. So I think that should be hopefully a good background to all of our figures, like what is going on. So let me move on to like the substance of my talk. What does al-Farabi think that Parmenides has to say, and why is refuting it so important? So what I'm going to go through now are different texts from Farabi, where he, not everything he says about Parmenides, but what I do in my book that is forthcoming next year is I show pretty much everything Farabi has to say about Parmenides. Here I'm just going to give you guys some digest, give you guys a few selections of the things he has to say, and explain to you what he thinks Parmenides is saying, what he thinks is problematic about it, and how he thinks, this will be the fourth part of the presentation, how he thinks Parmenides is able to convince anybody of his very radical ideas. Okay, so what does Farabi think Parmenides has to say, and why is refuting it so important? So these are quotes from a text by Farabi called The Philosophy of Aristotle. So he says, when Aristotle wanted to begin the investigation of natural science, he found sayings that contradict what is manifest to sense perception and what we can know intellectually from it, what we can know from sense perceptions. These sayings create doubt, affirming that there is no such thing as difference or otherness in existence. They conclude that all being is one. Consequently, the signification of different words is all one. There is neither utterance nor speech. This is a slightly shortened version of what Farabi says. It's a bit longer than that. So I'm going to go pass this out with you guys to show you exactly what he means by this. And here he's very clearly talking about Parmenides. He doesn't give his name, but it's very obvious who he's talking about. So Aristotle, right? I said to you that for Farabi and for most of the Islamic tradition, Aristotle is really seen the philosopher. So according to Farabi, when Aristotle wanted to start investigating the natural world, right, the science of like biology, what today we would call biology, chemistry, physics, philosophy in the ancient world encompassed all of these things. So when Aristotle wanted to begin his scientific investigations, before he could actually start doing that, he encountered these views, right, these sayings that contradict what is manifest to sense perception. What does that mean? It means he found people who deny that sense perception, that anything we can know from it, anything that we perceive in the world is real, right? They contradict it. They say that what you think you see, what you think you hear, isn't actually the case. And they contradict the idea that we can know anything intellectually from. So this is basic Aristotelian idea that our knowledge of the world begins with our perception of the world, right? Before, but our perception is actually a basis for knowledge, which is pretty much, I think, a premise in science, right? So what it's saying is that Aristotle encountered people who deny that very premise, right? They say that you can't know anything from what you perceive. And the sayings that he encountered, they were designed to create doubt, right? So this is another important theme in Farabi's engagement with Parmenides, is that it creates doubt, it makes us unsure of what we think we should know. And the sayings affirm that there is no such thing as difference or otherness in existence, which amounts to the conclusion that all being is one, everything is one. So when you think you're seeing different things, when you think you're seeing phenomena in the natural world, it's actually not real. So, and then another very kind of strange, kind of extreme conclusion then would be that words don't mean anything. Because if we think that words have got different meanings, we think we're saying we can say different things about things in the world, but if you think everything is one, then it means that words themselves are all one. There is no multitude of meaning. And so then the conclusion would be, there is neither utterance nor speech, right? So language no longer has any meaning. So these are all the radical conclusions that Farabi thinks Parmenides has, right? This is what Farabi thinks Parmenides is saying. And then why is refuting it so important? Well, because if you hold these views, if anybody were to hold these views, society can't really function. If language is meaningless, we can't know anything about the world, anything we think we see isn't real. It sounds kind of absurd. Why would anybody think this? That's going to be the next part of my talk, is how does Farabi think Parmenides is even able to convince anybody of this? It just kind of seems like madness, really. Like, why would anybody believe that language has no meaning? Why would anybody believe that our perception of the world is completely unreal? So how does Farabi think Parmenides convinces anybody of this? Well, there are a few different things Farabi thinks that Parmenides is doing. Okay, so he uses dialectic, he uses authority, and he misuses and abuses language. So I'll go through examples of those. Okay, and I'll explain what they mean. Dialectic. Okay, these are two quotes from Farabi's book of dialectic. He says, discourse with someone who denies that there is multiplicity and attempts to explain that being is one must be through syllogisms composed of widely accepted premises. For this reason, Aristotle said, when he wanted to begin addressing Parmenides, we are addressing dialecticians, even if there is some philosophy in their discourse. I'll explain that quote first. It's got some technical terms in there. So when you're talking with somebody who denies that there is any such thing as multiplicity, who says that all being is one, basically the sayings we described in the previous slide, if you're talking with those people, you have to use syllogism. Syllogism is a word for arguments, right? Or like logical arguments. You have to use logical arguments that are composed of widely accepted premises. What does that mean? That's a technical term here. He means that are commonly accepted but not proven. Okay, so this is the difference between dialectic and philosophy in Aristotle's thought and also in Farabi's thought, that dialectic is a style of debate that you have with somebody where you're not proving anything, you are just working with assumptions that everybody agrees on, but that are not proven. So it's actually an unscientific type of debate. So it can be we can sometimes use that with a pejorative. Here it has a pejorative meaning, that these people are not at the level of proof. They don't understand proof, they're not interested in proof. The only way to talk to them or engage with them is to use what are called widely accepted premises, things that we assume to be true, but we haven't proven to be true. And why is that? Why do we have to engage with these people on that level? It's because they are only at the level of dialectic. And dialectic is a lower level of knowledge. It's not really a level of knowledge than dialectic is a lower let's say path to knowledge, or lower, like it's kind of not quite the same thing as scientific knowledge, because it doesn't involve proof, it only involves shared assumptions. And then he says that's why Aristotle told us that when he's talking to Parmenides, we have to remember that we're addressing a dialectician. We're addressing somebody that doesn't work on the level of proof. We're addressing somebody that just uses assumptions that are, even if there is some philosophy in their discourse, a little bit of philosophy, but it's not really philosophy, it's basically dialect. Okay, the second quote, dialectical training encourages the student to test the received opinions that he had first encountered, was raised with, and was habituated to the point that it perhaps encourages many people in many times to be unsure of sensible things and to test them, as happened to Parmenides and Zeno. And this was to the point that they said there is no movement, there is no multiplicity, and that being is one. Okay, so this is also from the same text, the Book of Dialectic. And here Farabi is actually it's part of a longer passage where he talks about the benefits of dialectic. And he says that dialectic is actually a training for philosophy because it teaches you to test received opinions. It teaches you to question everything. So question the things you're taught that you don't really know why are true, but you're just taught that are true. The opinions that you first encounter, that you're raised with, and that you're habituated to. So all the things we're taught to believe, but without understanding why they're true. Dialectic is a good thing because it teaches you to question this. But it can sometimes go too far. So he says, to the point that it perhaps encourages many people and many times to be unsure of sensible things. What does he mean by sensible things? He means the things that we know through sense perception. Okay, so it's a technical meaning of sensible here, not the I think the battery ran out. So I'll try. Did Sahar leave the room? I joked with her before I started talking that what if the battery runs out? And it did. Okay, I'll try to project my voice until she comes back. So sensible things means, yeah, the things that, oh, okay, there's another one over here. Thank you. Great. Yeah, okay. So the sensible things are the what you call, like in philosophy, objects of sense perception. This meaning the things that you can see and hear, the things that you know through the five senses. So dialectic can sometimes go too far because it can make you question those things, make you question, are they real or not? Like, is what I'm seeing actually what I'm seeing? and to test those things, to start testing them, to try to find out if they're real or not. And then he says this is what happened to Parmenides and Zeno, is they just went too far to the point that they said, well, nothing we perceive is real. So Zeno is also a pre-Socratic who was part of the same circle as Parmenides, and they had similar ideas. And so this was to the point that they said there is no movement. Zeno was famous for saying that it's impossible to move. So you have a paradox in philosophy that's called Zeno's paradox, which is that he tries to prove that it's impossible to move because if I wanted to try to move from where I am now to over there, I have to first cross half the distance. But before I can cross half the distance, I have to cross half the distance of that. And before I can cross half the distance of that, I've got to cross half the distance of that. And the distances are infinitely divisible. And because they're infinitely divisible, you can never actually move anywhere. We move, but that's the argument that Zeno uses to say movement is impossible. And then obviously we know Parmenides is the one who says that there's no multiplicity and that being is one. So that's the first, this is what I call the dialectical, Farabi's dialectical explanation of Parmenides, that he is just misusing or not using dialectic properly, right? So he doesn't use things that can be, he remains at this level of dialectic, as we saw in the first quote, where he's talking about things that are not proven, that are just assumed, but then he's also questioning things to the point that it leads to absurdities. Okay, the next thing Farabi thinks that Parmenides relies on for his argument is authority. And for me, this is probably the most interesting passage. So I hope you guys like it too. Among the topics of dialectic are the contrived and utmost repulsive sayings that are upheld by intelligent people, well known for their proficiency in the sciences. Right? They're well known for being good scientists. This is such that there are widely accepted opinions, but we find a people well known by all for their proficiency in the sciences contradicting those widely accepted opinions. And consequently, the intelligence of the proponents would be on account of what contradicts the widely accepted. And their being well known for proficiency plunges into the soul the idea that maybe they have known something that others did not. This makes us doubt the widely accepted opinions, and then the widely accepted opinions become dialectical questions, like the saying of Parmenides that being is one, and the saying of Zeno that there is nothing that moves. Okay, this has also got technical terms, so let me break it down so you parse it out, because it is really interesting. So there, he's first of all describing contrived and repulsive sayings. So that's talking about the views of Parmenides and of Zeno. He says, well, we have these contrived and repulsive sayings, but they're upheld by intelligent people. We have people that seem to be pretty intelligent, Parmenides and Zeno, who say these things that are just completely crazy. And this is such that they are there are widely accepted opinions, right? There are things that everybody agrees are true, right? That the world has got multiple things in it and that we can move, right? We all widely accept that. But there are people well known by all for their proficiency in the sciences, meaning people who we think are scientists, people who we think are intelligent. And here he means Zeno. And these people contradict, right? They deny. They say the opposite of what is widely accepted. So they say the opposite of, so we all accept that we can move and we all accept that there are multiple things in the world. But then there are these supposedly intelligent people, these supposed scientists who say the opposite of that. And they say, no, movement is impossible and being is one. And so consequently, the intelligence of the proponents would be on account of what contradicts the widely accepted. This is a really important sentence. He's saying it would then seem that those scientists who are saying the opposite of what we think we know, it would then seem that their intelligence is because they contradict what is widely accepted, right? Is on account of it, that you seem to think, oh, well, if they're intelligent, if they're saying that, they must be intelligent, and so it must be because they're saying the opposite. It must be because they're saying these crazy things. That must be the sign of their intelligence. And so then they're being well known for proficiency, right? They're being known as intelligent. They're being famous. Their famous status as scientists plunges into the soul, right? Into our minds, basically. It makes us think. The idea that maybe they have known something that others have not, right? So then we start to think, oh, they must know something we don't know. Right? Plunges into the soul. So this idea of it gives us like deep like doubt inside of us that, oh, clearly, you know, we don't know what we think we know, they know. And this makes us doubt the widely accepted opinions. It makes us have doubt in the things that should otherwise be well accepted. And then the widely accepted opinions become dialectical, right? They become things that we should question. And this is like the saying of Parmenides, that being is one, and the saying of Zeno, that there is nothing that moves. So here, Farabi is explaining that Parmenides and his companion Zeno can make these crazy arguments because they rely on their authority. And it's their authority that makes people think, well, makes people question what should otherwise be self-evident. It makes people question their own ability to know something. It makes people question their own knowledge of the world, that, okay, there are these really smart people saying this, so I should follow them, right? So that seems to be, that's for Farabi, the second way that Parmenides is able to make these crazy claims and have anybody listen to him. Okay, the third way that Farabi thinks these claims can gain any sort of acceptance is through the misuse and abuse of language. So this is a quote from another text called the Book of Letters. I actually have a couple of texts, another slide on this as well. And here Farabi is explaining how words can be misunderstood or not understood correctly. So here he says, now the earliest among the ancients, meaning the ancient philosophers, used to engage in philosophy on the basis of what was understood from utterances according to unexamined opinion. And saying non-being was understood according to unexamined opinion as what has no quiddity at all. Hence, what is non-being in this way cannot possibly come to be, nor can a being actually obtain from it. They abolished anything changing according to any manner of change, and they said that one must not act in accordance with what appears to the senses, which is like the argument of Melissus. And this is the meaning Parmenides understood from non-being. He said, anything other than being is non-being, and what is non-being is nothing. Now, he only judged that what is not being is nothing because he understood what is not being as what has no quiddity at all. Okay, so I hope I haven't lost people here with this quote because it's very, very technical, but I'll try to explain it because it does have a few important takeaways that even if you're not into philosophy, hopefully you can appreciate. So that's the earliest among the ancients. Here he's talking about the pre-Socratics, right? And he doesn't seem to have a high opinion of the pre-Socratics. Right, Parmenides, Zeno, and here he's also mentioning Melissus as another pre-Socratic associated with Parmenides. He's saying these people, they did philosophy, but on the basis of what was understood from utterances according to unexamined opinion. So they're doing philosophy based on an unexamined opinion, basically something that hasn't really been properly investigated. They're doing philosophy, but they're not doing it properly because they haven't really examined what it is they're saying. They're kind of just saying stuff that doesn't have, doesn't completely follow. So that's the first critique, right, is that they're understanding language, right, utterances. They're using language in an unexamined way without really thinking it through. And how does that, like the example he has is that they take non-being, like to say that something is not something. They understand that to mean, according to unexamined opinion, as what has no quiddity at all. So if something is not, if you say it's not something, they understand that to mean it's nothing, which actually is not, doesn't really make sense because you can say something is not something, but it doesn't mean it's nothing, right? But that's the conclusion they come to. So if you kind of skip to the third line from the bottom, right, Parmenides' conclusion, it says Parmenides understood from non-being. He said that that just means non-being is nothing. And that's part of his argument. I'm not going to give you all the steps of the argument, but that's one of the crucial steps to then saying that everything is one, or all being is one, because non-being is nothing at all. And this, Farabi says, is a misuse or even an abuse of language, right? Using language in a really simplistic way. It also, in the middle part, right, in the end of this first paragraph, he says, hence, like if you understand non-being in this way, if you understand non-being to mean nothing, then you conclude that what is non-being in this way cannot possibly come to be, nor can a being actually obtain from it. That means that becoming is impossible. So you can never, and that's part of the argument for denying change, that if something isn't something right now, it means it's nothing, which means it can never become anything else. So nothing can ever change. Everything stays the same. Everything is static. And all of this results from a misunderstanding what it means to say something is not something. So then they abolish anything changing, meaning they deny that anything can ever change. Nothing changes. And then they said that one must not act in accordance with what appears to the senses. So they're saying, like, don't accept that anything you see is real. Because what you see when you see things, it looks like things are changing. It looks like things come in and into existence, out of existence. It looks like things move. It looks like things are multiple. And he's saying, well, they say that actually we have to abandon everything that appears to our senses. And he says this is the argument of Melissus, who's one of the students of Parmenides. And that's also then Parmenides' argument. Okay. More misuse and abuse of language. Also from the Book of Letters, Farabi says, by our saying nothing and our saying not a thing, what is meant is what has no quiddity at all, neither outside nor in the soul. This is the meaning Parmenides understood from other than being. Therefore, he said, everything other than being is not a thing, for he took being as though it were said synonymously, and other than being as though it signified what has no quiddity at all, not in any way. Therefore, he judged that it was not a thing. So what he concluded from this saying is that other than being is not a thing and has no quiddity at all. He thereby abolished the multiplicity of beings and made being one only. Yet he concluded from the very beginning that being is therefore one. This is again a very technical passage. It's saying something similar to the previous passage, that Parmenides understood that when you say not a thing, when you say something isn't something, that it means that it doesn't exist, that it's just not there. It's not outside, nor is it inside the soul. And so he took that meaning of not a thing, and he took the meaning of being, which he understood to be said synonymously, which means to be said with exactly the same meaning in all cases. He took those two ideas, which is actually a misuse or an abuse of language, and he put them together to get this conclusion, therefore there can only be one thing. And the reason he made that, the reason he could get to that argument was a misuse or a misunderstanding of language. And then he says he abolished the multiplicity of beings, so there's only one thing in existence. And then this is the last quote I'm going to read for you, which is also, I think, my second favorite quote. This is from his book of Sophistry, where he says, an example of the ambiguous term that can be misunderstood is evil gives benefit, and that which gives benefit is good, therefore evil is good. For evil gives benefit and good are said in many ways ambiguously. And likewise is the saying of the one who said, Parmenides, other than being is not being, and other similar sayings. So here he's likening Parmenides' argument that being is one to another similar argument that there's no difference between good and evil. And how are these arguments made, right? The argument that there's no difference between good or evil, or the argument that all being is one, he says they rest on ambiguity. So the argument that evil gives benefit, well, okay, we could accept that maybe there are evil derived from that, but then the meaning shifts in the second premise, that which gives benefit is good. So then suddenly well, if everything that, then now it's saying everything that gives benefit is good, then that must mean there's no, evil is good because evil gives benefit. But the shift here is that there's an ambiguity in giving benefit, right? Giving benefit doesn't necessarily mean that it's always good. But what the argument does is it collapses that distinction, right? It relies on an ambiguity, it relies on an equivocation to say then, well, evil is good, which is like a fallacious argument. It doesn't actually work, but it takes advantage of that ambiguity to get to this conclusion. And he says that Parmenides' argument does the same thing, right? It takes advantage of an ambiguity. So those are the three ways that Farabi thinks Parmenides can come to his radical conclusions, right? He uses dialectic, which doesn't involve proof, that just involves shared assumptions. He relies on authority, right? Which means that he relies on his own authority as a supposed scientist that then people are going to trust instead of trusting their own instincts. And then he relies on a misuse of language. He relies on equivocations. He relies on ambiguities. He relies on an unexamined way of using language. So what is the outcome of all of this then? Quick summary, right? Parmenides leads us to questioning things to the point of absurdity, right? To the point that we question everything we see, we question. It takes us to using language without examining what it really means, right? Just thinking, okay, if something is not something, that means it's nothing, right? So using language in an unexamined way, it results in rejecting sense perception, thinking that the world is an illusion, right? Because he explicitly says that they say we should not act in accordance with sense perception. We should not be paying attention to anything we see because the world is essentially an illusion. The world is not what it looks like. That there is no difference between good and evil, and that language loses all meaning, right? If we go back to that very first quote, that's also one of the things Farabi thinks happens with this argument, is then you can't say anything about the world. You can't know anything about the world. And so language is useless then. And we rely only on authority. The only way for us to know anything or think anything then would become the authority of somebody like Parmenides. So just in conclusion, contemporary relevance of this. So I think this, even though I've walked you guys through some kind of difficult, like philosophical arguments from the ancient and medieval period, I think it has a lot of contemporary relevance. Talking about things that still affect us today, right? The power of authority, right? The power of authority to make you question things that you should know or that you otherwise think you should know. And that we see, for example, cult leaders today, that's exactly the same thing that's going on, making people be known to them. Nihilism and the loss of meaning, right? So there's also Farabi saying that the Parmenides is, makes us think that no meaning to the world is an illusion, nothing is good, there's no difference between good or evil, there's no point to anything, basically. That's similar relevance to today when we talk about nihilism. And then finally, the loss of a sense of reality, right? The loss of a sense of good or evil, similar to my previous point, right? Like loss of meaning, loss of direction, and then back to the reliance on authority. So a loss of, I think, a loss of a sense of self, I think, is one of the things that comes out of this that is maybe relevant to maybe contemporary discussions. So anyway, that's it. And thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much.
When you stepped out, the battery died.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. I was out there trying to see if I could browbeat the people doing construction into stopping.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't even find them. There was a black hole with loud noise coming out of it. Okay, I found myself while listening to your talk thinking about, so I'm a political scientist. This is an occupational hazard that I think about politics all the time. And I found myself wondering if some of our contemporary political figures may have read up on this use and abuse of language between the Parmenides of Elea and al-Farabi more effectively use and abuse language. But I will save that question for after, if we have time. I'd like to open it up to the audience. Share with us your questions. What has come up for you?
I wonder if you can give me a particular example of a concrete argument that Parmenides gave that's a dialectic. I was just having a hard time kind of picturing in my mind. It seemed like you were talking kind of the dialect that's more in the abstract, but I was wondering if you can give me like a concrete case.
Okay, so dialectic would be like where you question things, right? So one person has one opinion, the other person has another opinion. And the goal is not to prove one or the other with proofs, but it's to argue dialectically. So to say like, but only be using shared assumptions. So it's the idea, at least the theory of dialectic in this period, is you have to have shared assumptions with the person you're engaging in dialectic with. And you don't necessarily even have to believe your position, and they don't have to believe their position. It's just kind of like an exercise. But it revolves around asking questions. So the argument, like the Parmenides would be saying is, well, okay, this is like, well, I think this is one example. The idea, maybe this is from Zeno, that you, no, I think this is Parmenides. Why can't you believe your senses? Why are your senses untrustworthy? And so you want to get your opponent to, first of all, accept an example of when following sense perception is untrustworthy. And so I think one of the examples they give is when you see something really far away and it looks really small, so it looks smaller than something that's closer to you, but actually that thing is bigger than what is closer to you. But according to your senses, according to sense perception, it looks smaller. And so what somebody like Parmenides would do is get the opponent to accept that that is the case. Okay, when you look at the stars, they look smaller than the objects in front of you, but they are actually bigger than the objects in front of you. So then once you've got your opponent to accept that, then you say, well, can't you see then that sense perception is unreliable? What you think you know from sense perception isn't true. Like the argument they say is that sense perception is not a good witness. It's not a reliable witness. So then you have to accept that if it's not a reliable witness in this case, it's never a reliable witness. But you see, as I said, that's not actually a proof, right? Because just because like that one example doesn't prove that it's never a reliable witness, but dialectic doesn't involve proof. It just involves getting your opponent to concede one thing, and then you can like broaden the argument out from that. So that would be like a dialectical way of, like one of the dialectical ways Parmenides would say, don't trust your senses.
Okay, thanks. It also seems like he then makes this huge gap about worries about epistemology, then to make a metaphysical conclusion about the world, that there's just everything's just one. But I know you're not like trying to kind of Parmenides, but it seems like a big jump.
Oh yeah, it is. I mean, it is a huge jump. I didn't walk you through all the steps of the argument because I thought it might be a bit too dense. But basically, I mean, I gave you like the main part of it, which is that he jumps from a what's called like a relative sense of non-being to an absolute sense of non-being. So just because something is relatively not something else doesn't mean that it's not anything at all. And that's like the fallacy in the argument, is he says, well, non-being just means nothing. So once X is not Y, it means that X is not, which means that X is nothing. And if you say that about everything, then, and if you say that to be only has one meaning, then there can only actually be one being. So it's like a fallacious logical argument that in other texts, Farabi says, you don't even need to disprove logically because it's self-evident that it's wrong because sense perception tells us that it's wrong. But that's why Parmenides is relying on like different, like one is to disable our trust in ourselves, and one is to disable our trust in sense perception of anything that can be known or that you can know anything from, and then to say, okay, and then you should just rely on this fallacious argumentation that relies on ambiguous language and like unexamined use of language. So it doesn't make sense in any way whatsoever. And obviously I'm not defending it. And that's actually why I was interested in it, is why does Farabi spend so much time this argument that clearly makes no sense. I just gave you a small selection of his text. He talks about this in many places. That was like the motivating factor for this research is, if it's so absurd, why does he spend all this time refuting it? And I think it's, for me, I think it's because he's interested in the edifice, and he sees this, although it's some sort of absurdity, it's something that threatens like the entire edifice of knowledge. It threatens all possibilities to know anything. So he sees it as something deserving of like time, basically, be spent like figuring out like how this works, even though it clearly doesn't make sense.
I barely hang on about all this. My question might be sounding very weird, but I'm not arguing, but is it safe to present like he's just talking about metaphysics and maybe he was just ahead of his time in some way? Because,
And you say he, I mean Parmenides? Or
yes, Parmenides, sorry, because it is abstract and condensed, but in some way his the perception we have does change throughout like centuries. I mean, even just what we see colors have changed, what we think we saw. So in some way, maybe, is it safe to say like how he spoke about it was condensed, but at the same time it was like a first opening door?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I mean, I've been working with the assumption like throughout the talk and like the Q&A so far that it doesn't make any sense and it's absurd. But there's also a reason why philosophers talk about it and pay attention to it, because that like, and that was like the Aristotle quote that Farabi gave us earlier. There is some philosophy in it. There's something in it that like, maybe, I mean, I guess I don't want to say that it's got any truth to it, but it's not entirely dumb, right? You mentioned like change, like to what extent is change, you said something about the colors, right? Parmenides is making a metaphysical argument that, and this is the contemporary interpretation of Parmenides, is they try to say, actually, he's not saying all this crazy stuff. He's trying to say that like the underlying principle of being doesn't change. Like underlying, there's an unchanging reality. And then you have another realm of sensory perception of the world that is real, but it's called the phenomenal realm. It's like the realm of changing phenomena, the realm of movement, the realm of multiplicity, but there's a truer like realm that underlies it that doesn't have any of those things. So that's a contemporary reading of Parmenides that maybe is what you're hinting at, that like he's not saying absurd things, he's just saying that there's like one underlying principle to everything.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you talked about how Robbie is defending maybe like greater knowledge by pointing out the flaws of Parmenides, and there's relevance in this analysis today. I was wondering if there's contemporaries to Farabi that he's concerned about, that
Yeah.
a cause for him to write this kind of, or to have this concern about knowledge being misused.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've had that before. Farabi is kind of an enigmatic figure. He doesn't really talk much about his times and his life or in his contemporaries. And so there's no explicit reason for us to think that there's anybody around him who is saying these things or promoting these things. And I'm inclined to think that, yeah, there is no reason to say there's anybody around him motivating this. I'm not saying it's not at all, but we don't really have the sources to say that. And from what I know of Farabi as a philosopher, this all makes sense to me, that he would be concerned with these issues, even if there's nobody around him who is saying this stuff, because it's all about the theory, right? So that's why I tried to explain in the beginning that he saw progression in philosophy from the pre-Socratics, who had like these unexamined opinions, to Socrates, to Plato, to Aristotle, who really perfected knowledge, who gave us the system of knowledge, everything we need to know about the world. And that he saw the job of philosophers, of himself and any philosopher after Aristotle, is to preserve that knowledge. And so that's why, to me, it makes sense that he would be concerned with Parmenides, even if it didn't have relevance to his society, because it had massive relevance to his project, what he was doing, which is preserving this edifice of knowledge. So the first text I showed you called, that was from Philosophy of Aristotle, that's where he actually writes the biography of Aristotle, not the real biography, but his imagined biography of how Aristotle went on this intellectual journey to know everything and to then give us philosophy as this perfected science. And he saw his job as recounting this story and teaching it. And he actually has another text where he claims for himself like the role of reviving philosophy after it had been dead under Christian rule, which is also ironic because his teachers were Christian. So that's kind of a strange irony. But what I take from that text is he gives himself this like massive role as like being this like knowledge preserver and like instructor of philosophy. So then the view of Parmenides is going to be like a massive threat. So whether anybody else holds it or not, the fact that it exists, and Aristotle talks about Parmenides a lot. So clearly then he's going to see it as some sort of underlying threat that needs to be dealt with, whether or not anybody else in his time even knew about it.
Hi, I was wondering if you know how other Muslim intellectuals, scholars, philosophers view Parmenides?
Other Muslim philosophers?
Other Muslim intellectuals in different time periods, maybe because I know that, or I read that, there was some support for the idea that the world was one.
Yeah,
Because they, use that to kind of, explain monotheism, or support their idea that like God created everything, God was at the root of everything.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there were like different views, regarding Parmenides.
yeah, that's a great question. So you're right on the second part. There is an idea in Islamic philosophy called the oneness of existence or the oneness of being that became extremely popular a few centuries after Farabi. So Farabi's in the 10th century, and this idea of the oneness of being comes about, like, I don't know, like 13th, 14th, 15th century, so a little bit afterwards. So that's definitely there, but I'm not sure, and nobody's really talked about if this has any connection to Parmenides. So far, I don't think it does. Farabi, for his period, like the 10th century, like the 8th, 9th, 10th, even 11th century, even the 12th century, and onwards, he's pretty much the only Islamic philosopher that talks about Parmenides, which is another reason why I don't think that there was necessarily anybody in his lifetime that was promoting these views, because there's nobody else apart from him that talks about it. And in fact, the famous successor to Farabi in the Islamic philosophical tradition, Avicenna actually says that he doesn't understand Parmenides or what this is all about, and he just has like one line on it. He's like, "It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not going to talk about it." So, and most scholars in my field, or in fact, nobody in my field has ever talked about the reception of Parmenides in the Islamic tradition, because there isn't one outside of Farabi. And in fact, if you read like encyclopedia articles on Parmenides in the Islamic world, like the famous one says that, well, none of the Muslim philosophers paid any attention to Parmenides. He wasn't really very important because his ideas were just very removed from Islamic beliefs. For the most part, there is no reception. But you're still right that this idea of the oneness of being becomes a huge idea in the centuries later. I haven't figured it out. I haven't figured out if it has any connection to the Parmenides stuff. It seems like it should, but it's not entirely clear to me. And that's also because the field of Islamic philosophy is still a young field. Like I said, I'm the only person that's ever talked about Farabi and Parmenides. Why is that? It's just because it's a young field. So maybe in a couple of decades' time, I'll be able to tell you there's a link between Parmenides and the subsequent oneness of being theories, but right now I haven't seen one.
I want to, so let's look at it from the historical perspective rather than philosophical perspective. So, Parmenides, I mean, it sounds like to me at least, as much as I know about the pre-Socratics, it's very possible that his model was very close to the Pythagorean. Now, if it is true, then it means that he was more of a spiritual guru than a philosopher. So, if that's the case, then their criticism, and it started with Aristotle, this is not Farabi's fault, but their defensive criticism, trying to save philosophy from these spiritual gurus of the time, is kind of partial and unfair in many ways. And what I'm saying is that, like Pythagoras, Parmenides' sayings could make sense in the context of prescribed lifestyle, spiritual guidance, but the way that Pythagoras actually made sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think like that's why the sound so absurd. It's almost like taking a biblical prophet's sayings and trying to treat them and predict them as philosophers, as logical philosophers.
Yeah.
That makes no sense.
Yeah.
So, and I wonder whether we don't know much about Parmenides. Obviously, that's the problem.
Yes.
I think we have one coin, if I remember well, that
Oh,
leads him to Apollos, like cult in Elea. Okay. One coin. And but we, for example, we know the introduction to the poem where he claims, supposedly, that he received mystical
Yeah.
knowledge from the goddess. So what he's telling you is actually knowledge. He's communicating the knowledge from the gods. So if that was part of the original poem, I wonder actually if Farabi didn't know about this. Did he talk about this introduction at all, the poem?
So, okay, you raised amazing points. I'm very happy you said all of that. So yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that this has nothing to do with the real historical Parmenides because we don't really know much about him. Most of what survives, as I had mentioned, is in like later fragments. Farabi did not read Parmenides directly, so I do talk about that in the book. I think the only access he had to these fragments of Parmenides are actually in the writings of Aristotle. So the fragments of Parmenides are found partially in Aristotle, but also in a number of other what's called Neoplatonic texts. I don't think Farabi had access to those. I think he only knew the Parmenides that was presented in Aristotle. So the goddess stuff from the beginning, no, I don't think Farabi knew that at all. And you're completely right that maybe the way we're reading Parmenides is off, it's wrong. Like we're approaching him like he's supposed to be some sort of logician, and he's not. Like you said, he begins his poem or the proem by saying that he's received revelation from the goddess. And so maybe it makes more sense to see him in like the more of like the Pythagoreans. And there are, I believe, like Greek sources that try to make a link between Parmenides and Pythagoras, that Pythagoras was like some sort of, I don't know if they say student, but they definitely try to make a link. I can't remember what it is. But there are definitely Greek sources that say there's some sort of connection between the Eleatic school of Parmenides, Zeno, Melissus, and then the Pythagoreans. So that's there in the Greek sources, but those are not the sources Farabi had. I'm pretty sure the only source he had was Aristotle, who, as you say, maybe is approaching Parmenides in a very unfair way. But that's also, I mean, this is something that's talked about in contemporary scholarship too, is that Parmenides' poem is split into two sections. The Way of the Truth, which is where he outlines the monistic theory, like everything's one. And then he has the Way of Perception, or the Way of Illusion, where he talks about the natural world. And that section is like way longer than the Way of the Truth, where he spends like a lot of time on talking about the natural world and natural phenomena but we only have a really small fragment of it. And so what scholars say is that the bias in how to interpret Parmenides already took place in antiquity, because our sources already preserve most of the monistic part, but very little of what they call the phenomenal part, like only a tiny bit. So there was already a preference in antiquity for seeing Parmenides as concerned with this monism and this, all is one. But if we had the whole poem, we would see that that's just one tiny part. So we don't have a full picture of him. And as you said, maybe the things he's teaching make much more sense in an ethical or spiritual context, but maybe you're probably right, but from the perspective of the history of philosophy, like my angle, I guess I'm not really interested in uncovering the real Parmenides. I mean, I obviously I am in this discussion, but like from the work I'm doing is really more looking at how these things are received and developed over time. And that's obviously like those are results of choices and interpretations that are not necessarily the right ones, but that's what happened. And that's how we ended up with Farabi talking about this absurdity, which maybe was never actually an absurdity. Thank you.
I just had a question about whether al-Farabi was more critical than say Aristotle was. And I'm not remembering the exact quote here, but in Aristotle's Metaphysics, when he's talking about all the pre-Socratics, he attributes to Parmenides and Zeno what we would now call an argument ad absurdum. And if I remember right, it says these were the first people to argue this way. Right? Which seems like an acknowledgement of an actual sort of logical syllogism as opposed to what we would call dialectic and sort of proto logical stuff. I know Aristotle didn't agree with the conclusions, but he seems to give credit for more straightforward logical coherence than at least what you said so far about al-Farabi. So I'm wondering if al-Farabi was actually more critical than Aristotle.
Yeah. So in the physics, you were talking about the metaphysics. In the physics, Aristotle says that the arguments of Parmenides are asyllogistic, right? So that usually gets translated as like the arguments do not follow, but the actual Greek word is saying like asyllogistic. And I think Farabi's main inspiration is the physics. I think book 1, like chapters 2 and 3, which is like the main, like the longest engagement Aristotle has with Parmenides is there, where he says that they have false premises, right? So their premise is that sense perception is untrustworthy. That's a false premise. But even then, they try to use those false premises to make syllogistic logical arguments, but that they fail because they're asyllogistic and the conclusions do not, even from the false premises, they don't follow. But then on top of that, the premises are false. So that's, I think, the main inspiration. There are other passages in Aristotle, like you said, that are not quite as critical. One of them, I think, is in like Alpha Elaton of the Metaphysics, but that wasn't actually translated into Arabic. So that's really interesting. And in that passage, Aristotle does admit that Parmenides does accept the phenomenal being, like, the phenomenal, like sense perception. He seems to admit it, but I can't remember exactly what he says, but Farabi didn't have access to that passage. And so you're right, actually, you guys are together helping me see that Farabi's take on Parmenides is really the result of like, not only Aristotle's particular interpretation, but a very narrow interpretation of Aristotle as well. So it's like over time, like the interpretation is getting more and more narrow and more strict, and as you said, like more and more critical. So I would agree, and I think that's maybe just what happens in the history of philosophy. As the ideas get zoned in more and more. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions from the audience members? Okay, in that case, I'm going to take the host's liberty to ask one final question as we wrap up, since we have just a couple more minutes. Again, always thinking about how this reflects in our current politics. So I was wondering if you could touch on what you think this discussion between the two ancient philosophers, what this can tell us, or how it might be able to guide us when we're trying to understand the twists and turns, and let's charitably call them, distortions that we might encounter out there in the political world.
Oh, what it can tell us about distortions in the current political world. I think it can tell us a lot. Like, it can tell us that we need to recognize when arguments being made based on assumptions rather than on proof. That's one like general idea about dialectic, but you can find that if you read any Islamic philosopher, they talk about this. But specifically with regards to like what I presented today, I think the main thing is ambiguous arguments or like fallacious arguments. So the one I showed you guys about how you can conclude that evil is no different, there's no difference between good and evil based on like equivocating, like misusing like the meanings of giving benefit. I think that's something like the tool you can use when you're looking at contemporary discourse is to what extent are the arguments relying on like equivocations or relying on like reframing the meaning of something. So using one meaning and then using a different meaning. So then you can come to a conclusion that doesn't really work, but it's because it's relying on these different meanings of the same word or the same concept. And then authority. That's like, I think the biggest, like I mentioned in the talk, that's like my favorite quote, the authority quote, where you think that just because somebody intelligent or famous for their, position as whatever, some sort of specialist or expert, that somehow then trusting them as in giving up what should otherwise be self-evident. So putting too much trust and not the big takeaway for like for the modern context is authority does not, and even supposed expertise, like that's what he was saying there, is people think that Parmenides is an expert. So even supposed expertise should never be enough to make somebody like abandon what should be self-evident. And then you have other questions that result from that. Okay, well, sometimes of course we have to rely on expertise. So I'm not saying we should abandon expertise, but it's about knowing the difference between when do you trust expertise and when is it actually potentially somebody who's misusing, right? So not everybody who's an expert is always going to be trustworthy in all moments at all times, right? So you should never give up that like individual sense of kind of a sense of like what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's false. You can never put all of your trust in some sort of expert or some sort of authority. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, if there are no other questions, please everyone help me thank Dr. Ansari again. Thank you so much. We
You're
so
welcome.
appreciate you coming. We stop on the record. Anyone who was asking about the